Whether we like it or not, the One Piece manga has entered its final saga. But in many ways, we're lucky that it's even lasted this long because this is a story that originally was thought by Oda himself to only last about 5 years. He probably had no idea that it was going to become the 26-year global phenomenon and best-selling comic of all time that it is today. And for good reason. I mean, very few stories last this long, especially ones with weekly releases. Oda's averaged about 42 chapters per year over the course of the story, with that number trending downward a little bit more recently with the longer breaks he's been taking, but early in his career that average was just under 50. So in another universe, One Piece may have only lasted around 250 chapters or so if it had to end after 5 years. I mean, to give you an idea, chapter 250 is when Luffy and Sanji defeat Satori in Skypiea. I mean, maybe Oda could lengthen some of the chapters or add information elsewhere, but regardless, there's still quite a bit that he would have to leave out if he didn't get to keep writing. But another important thing to remember is that Oda is an author who has always known the ending to his story, and the best place to look for endgame answers is the beginning, back when Oda was thinking that he still had to wrap things up sooner rather than later, and that's exactly why I made this video. I'm not usually one for what ifs, but I think that by looking back at the beginning of the story and considering how Oda may have been plotting to end it in 5 years, could actually give us a lot of insights into how it'll actually end in the final saga in front of us. I mean, why do you think that characters from the very beginning like Vivi, Crocodile, Buggy, Shanks, and even Wapol have come back in a major way? Alabasta, the first place we learn of poneglyphs and an ancient weapon, has also come back into focus. Blackbeard is finally starting to make his final moves, and we just saw in chapter 1089 that another hole was created just like the one at Enies Lobby, where our crew first declared war on the government. Oda had a lot of things set up to end it early if he needed to, but he just didn't have to. He ended up getting to cook pretty much as long as he wanted, and that gave us the 26-year story that we all love today. But nonetheless, it's all going to circle back to the beginning because Oda has always known his ending. So knowing all of what we know now from the 26 plus years One Piece has been running, I want to take a stab at guessing how Oda would have ended it after just 5 years if he had to, and then I'll also explain what that could mean for the final saga that we have in front of us. And of course, if you end up enjoying the video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. It does wonders for the algorithm, and about 80% of you who watch my videos anyway may have forgotten to hit subscribe last time you were here, so I'd really appreciate it. So let's start by covering some of what we know for sure about Oda's initial plans with the story. Like the fact he had always planned to have 4 emperors, but he thought later that the warlords were just too cool not to add. And on top of that, the supernova were made up right before Saba Odi. So in the universe where Oda ended One Piece after just 5 years, I think it's likely that the warlords and supernova just wouldn't exist, and we would have almost started the Grand Line with an emperor saga of sorts, since that's the group Oda himself said had always been a part of the plan, which would mean the power structure of the entire One Piece world would have been different. The warlords, emperors, and marines help maintain a balance in the real version of the story that we read, but I think just the emperors and marines could mimic that same effect if Oda wanted them to. I mean, they're almost doing that now because the government has the SSG with the Seraphim, who are kind of replacing the warlords, but nonetheless you have the same power structure without the actual warlords. But in this version of the story, who would have been the 4 emperors? Well, I think the 2 immediate locks are Shanks and Whitebeard. Shanks should just be obvious, and Ace was pursuing Blackbeard since fairly early in the story, going at least back to Drum Island, where Ace visited before our crew did, so that kind of inherently means Whitebeard would have been relevant even to that version of the story, since Ace and Blackbeard's feud both stem from their time on that crew. But the 3rd emperor that I'm pretty confident in would still be Kaido, actually. And the reason I don't think Big Mom would be one is for a couple reasons. First, she wasn't mentioned till after the Summit War, which makes her the last one named as it is, and while Whole Cake is actually my favorite arc in the entire story, her island just isn't quite as relevant to the overarching themes of the story like Wano is. We heard of Kaido in Thriller Bark, where we also heard of Wano, and he was even going to show up to Marineford apparently. Now obviously Wano is deep in the New World, so there's a big question of how Oda would have roped him into such a shorter version of One Piece, but I'll discuss that later in the video when I bring up Kuma. And then the last Emperor of the Sea in this version of the story, I think would have actually been Crocodile. Now obviously in the almost 1100 chapter story we have right now, I don't think most of us would put Crocodile anywhere near the strength of the other emperors, not named Buggy, but this is a totally different universe we're talking about. And 1v1 strength aside, Crocodile was in the process of taking over Alabasta, a country where where we first learned of the poneglyphs, of an ancient weapon, and of one of the original families that now reside in Marijois, except obviously they turned that down. And like I mentioned, Vivi is becoming a focal point of the story now with all the talk about Lily and the D clan, which shows just how vital that country has always been to the grand scheme of the story. Remember, Oda has always known the ending, so there's a reason this one's coming back. So Croc was absolutely onto something even 900 chapters ago, and that may be because of something that ties to his past, which I covered in detail in this video involving rocks. But when Oda mapped out the Grand Line portion of the story, he probably planned on Crocodile being Luffy's first Emperor battle instead of his first Warlord battle. But once Oda got the all clear to keep writing the story as long as he wanted, he probably had to make Crocodile a Warlord to slow the power creep and build the story up in a way that makes sense. Again, that is why Crocodile is coming back in a major way now. The role that he may have played originally in the 5-year version of the story is the one he's going to ultimately play here in the final saga. I mean, he may not be an emperor right now, but he's technically one of the commanders, or like the de facto leader of an emperor crew right now, so he is fitting that mold already. But after Alabasta, we went to Skypiea, where we found a poneglyph that, over the last 400 years, had only been found by Roger. This is the same guy who's the only person to find Laugh-Tale in the last 800 years. I mean, of all the poneglyphs he found, the only one he left a message at was the one in Skypiea, and the message said that he would guide that passage to the ends of the world. Even Enel, who was the supposed god of Skypiea, didn't know the poneglyph was up there until Robin said something about it. If Oda was truly going to end One Piece in 250 to maybe 300 chapters or so, then I think Skypiea would have been the perfect place to have the one and only single road poneglyph. Of course, in our version, there are 4 of those, but Oda could have done whatever he wanted back then. And with a short timeline to finish the story, it would make sense to find the path to Laugh-Tale somewhere around this time. And what better place to put that than the sky? The entire point of Jaya and meeting Blackbeard, who is likely the main pirate antagonist in the story, was to highlight how important it was to follow your dreams even when other people laugh at it. Going to the sky was an absurd idea to most people, but Luffy still went for it. The main reason he did so was to ring the bell and clear the Mont Blanc name, to find the city of gold that the government tried to write books about to dissuade people from even searching for. Even by One Piece standards, it's crazy to see an island get launched into the sky. And for the bell and poneglyph to go to the top of Giant Jack specifically. Nobody ever found that thing until Roger showed up. Enel took the gold from the rest of the city, but never looked up for the bell, which is kind of ironic because the Blue Sea people never thought to look up for Skypiea, and the Skypeans never thought to look up for the bell and the poneglyph. For so many reasons, I think this arc was originally meant to be about Luffy finding the path to Laugh-Tale. We also first heard of the Sun God here, we saw Luffy in the Nika pose for the first time here, even the idea of a Klabautermond was introduced here, which is kind of a supernatural thing. The leaders were called gods, just like the Celestial Dragons are called, and the Skypeans, Shandorians, and Birkins were all originally from the moon, which had a lot of advanced technology involved there, potentially somewhat like the Ancient Kingdom had. So at this point, after finding the way to Laugh-Tale, Luffy would have needed to go finish his dream and get the One Piece. And that's why the next island was Long Ring Longland, the only place we've ever heard the name Davy Jones. But as I mentioned before, Oda would be around 250 to 300 chapters after 5 years, and Long Ring Longland doesn't even start till chapter 303. So I think this is the perfect spot to just pause for a moment and briefly discuss how things could have been shrunken down before this point to fit the timeline that I mentioned. And for the most part, I think the first 100 chapters would be basically the same. Oda likely wrote most of those assuming he still had to end the story in 5 years anyway, and the anime came out just a few months after Logtown, which bolstered its popularity quite a bit and likely helped Oda's case to keep writing as long as he wanted. And that also probably means the geography of the One Piece world would be mostly the same, with the Red Line still dividing the world into the 4 blues, Grand Line, Calm Belts, etc. So at least logistically, the journey in the shorter version of the story would probably be kind of similar to what we actually saw in the pre-time skip, just shrunken down. So it's really after Reverse Mountain that we need to start thinking about how Oda would rework things to end in just another 150 to 200 chapters. And to start, I don't think we'd really need Whiskey Peak whatsoever. It served as a way to introduce Baroque works in the Alabasta saga, but we already had that a little bit in Reverse Mountain, and that continued in Little Garden. But Little Garden Garden is also where we meet our first giants and hear of Elbaf, so that one's a lot more necessary. I would even argue that Oda could cut out some of the Mr. 3 candle stuff in Little Garden, since that took a whole 6 chapters by itself, which is actually a good amount of time at this point in the story. So removing Whiskey Peak and shortening Little Garden would cut off around 12 chapters right away, while still keeping all the major elements like the Baroque Works intro, Sanji talking to Crocodile, Elbaf introduction, and so forth. But then we moved on to Drum Island, which actually introduced to us so many different things that are yet again becoming more important in the final saga. This is where we learned about the Will of D and Gold Roger's true name, the Reverie and Dragon's threat to the government, Zone Fruits, which was the last of the 3 to be shown, a human fruit, which we now know Luffy's fruit is a mythical model of, Kureha having some secret to her youth, while we just learned Emu may be around 800 years old. We met Wapol, who just saw what happened to Cobra, and we were even introduced to Ace's conflict with Blackbeard. I mentioned before how there wouldn't be warlords in the shorter version of the story, so Blackbeard and Ace's conflict would have likely gone a lot differently. Without a warlord position to leverage Luffy or Ace for, maybe Blackbeard would have just killed Ace outright for a bounty, like his crew may be doing with Garp to the Cross Guild right now. In both instances, Blackbeard could be exchanging Luffy's family for money, so I don't think Drum Island would have been shortened very much, if at all, because it was just jam-packed with endgame elements. Not to mention the Here You Luck flashback is still one of the best in the entire story, so I doubt Oda would get rid of that at all. So maybe he saves a few chapters here and there, but this would actually be pretty similar even in a 5-year version of One Piece, I think. But after that was of course Alabasta, which I already discussed in detail from Crocodile's perspective, but from a more macro point of view, I think this arc would fill a similar purpose to Wano actually, which is the arc that kind of led us right into the current final saga. So in a 5-year version, Alabasta would have probably led to one as well. Alabasta had the Pluton Poneglyph, while Wano had the actual Pluton. Croc was Luffy's first warlord, and Kaido was Luffy's first emperor. Both islands appeared to be against the government after the Void Century, and both have distinct ties to the Poneglyphs, where they were made in Wano by the Kazuki, but apparently Lily's blunder is responsible for them being scattered around the world. But one potentially hot take here that I actually think makes a lot of sense in regards to Alabasta is that in a 5-year version, Pluton would have probably been the only ancient weapon. We've had Uranus mentioned one time in 26 years as it is, so I have a hard time thinking Oda could flesh out 3 in a shorter version. Pluton was mentioned first and was also heavily involved in Enies lobby with the blueprints. No weapon has been mentioned nearly as much as that one in the story. I mean, it's been tied to 3 arcs now if you count Wano as well, while Poseidon was mainly tied to 1 and then also mentioned at the end of Skypiea, and Uranus is barely even a thing, although I do have some videos on it that you might want to go check out. Now, maybe Poseidon could still exist in some other capacity in a shorter version, but the colossal battleship Pluton being the only official ancient weapon originally does make some sense, especially given the importance on technology lately in regards to the high-tech ancient kingdom. As for how many chapters Oda could save here, I actually think there's a decent amount. This was by far the longest arc when it originally came out, like twice as long as any other, and I think at least part of that is because Oda knew at this point that he could write almost as long as he wanted, so he probably added a lot of stuff around the edges of this arc. If Oda was in crunch time, I just doubt he would have taken a whopping 63 chapters, or almost 30% of the story as of the end of it. And then following Alabasta, we have Jaya and Skypiea. I already covered some of the important factors, like the fact it would lead us to the one and only road Poneglyph, and that makes me think the arc could be a lot like Zou, which was actually just 23 chapters. That arc mainly acted as a major info dump, telling us how the Poneglyphs worked and revealing a connection between the Kazuki and the Ancient Kingdom, and this is even where we met Zunisha, who eventually revealed Joy Boy had returned because of the Drums of Liberation. I think Skypiea would have been very similar in Oda's original vision. Like I mentioned earlier, we heard of the Sun God there, saw Luffy in the Nika pose, learned the Shandians were tied to the Ancient Kingdom and the Moon, etc. And with the White Sea being separated from the Blue Sea, Oda could have done almost anything he wanted up there. One of the big criticisms of Skypiea that I've heard is how it's separated from the rest of the One Piece world that we've come to know and love. People on the Blue Sea didn't even think it was possible for land to be up there. And it's hard to blame them because I mean it really shouldn't. And nobody knew about Enel or anything else going on up there. But that's what probably would make this arc so important in Oda's original version. It could have been almost literally whatever he wanted, which just makes it the perfect place to hide all this vital information. After Alabasta, with all the cuts I've mentioned, we'd maybe be around 200 chapters or a little less. And the entire Sky Island saga, including Jaya, was 85 chapters, even more than Alabasta. But I think Oda could have easily shrunken that down to like 40 or less if he was just just trying to get to the key information. Jaya was 18 chapters as it is, and if Skypiea was as long as something like Zoe, that would have made it a total of 41, putting us at right around chapter 240 or so as our crew would head to Laugh-Tale. And I know I said earlier 250 chapters is a good estimate for 5 years, but Oda was never good with timelines anyway, and if we stay under 300, then it's still less than 6 years, so it still kinda counts. So with the road poneglyph in tow and Robin giving Nami some destination to go to, they would all likely go get the One Piece, and that's exactly why the island after Skypiea is Long Ring Longland. Now, I may be a bit biased because my biggest videos all involve Laugh-Tale being underneath here, but the timing and geography of all of this stuff just makes too much sense. I'll put the link down below for those of you who want all of the information, but here's some quick cliff notes just for the uninitiated. This is the only place we've heard of Davy Jones, one of the biggest seafaring tales there is, and everything is stretched out, which is not unlike our protagonist, Luffy. The island itself is literally a crown shape, which a crown-shaped island is fitting for a pirate king, but that only gets revealed one day a year during Agua Laguna, which just so happened to occur right after the Straw Hats left that island. And again, we just saw in chapter 1089 that holes like the one at Enies Lobby, which isn't that far from Long Ring Longland, cause massive floods. So what is the connection here, and why does Aqua Laguna cause a tsunami every single year? And why does that water come from Long Ring Longland since it experiences low tide at the same time? Well, I think that's all a hint that Laugh-Tale is underneath it somewhere. And if Oda had simply kept our crew at Long Ring Longland just 1 or 2 days longer, they'd have been there when it looked like a crown and potentially revealed Laugh-Tale to our crew all the way back in the pre-time skip. So if Oda was ending his story on the original timeline, I think he would have for sure given us the road poneglyph at Skypiea and then just had it direct us right to Long Ring Longland since it was kind of the next island anyway. The island even has weird geographic anomalies like having 10 different points, which could maybe tie to the 10 crew members Luffy's always wanted, and we've seen various symbols from Ancient Kingdom allied nations around the world that also have 8 or 10 points in a circle like that as well, kinda symbolizing the sun in most cases, and each of those points on the actual island is really boring and empty, so it's like nobody would ever bother to check it out. I mean, it's fitting that this arc sits right before Enies Lobby, where our crew declared war on the government. Oda could have easily reworked this section of the story to be an actual ending, or at least a precursor to it, since it already revolved around Robin and O'Hara, the Pluton blueprints, and even the weapon itself since it was built at Water 7. And to a lesser degree, it also revolved around technology, which is something we're seeing right now in Egghead, so I think there could be a connection between the two. Other than the Pluton blueprints and the fact we met Frankie here, who has his own connections to Vegapunk, post Enies Lobby is actually where Vegapunk was name dropped, and Spandam had Funkfried, who was made by Vegapunk. So even though we don't think of it this way, Enies Lobby did serve as a decent precursor to what we're seeing at Egghead. I mean, where did we meet CP9 originally? Enies Lobby. Where are they now? Egghead, or at least some of them. And what did we learn about right away in Egghead? Light, because of the holograms and the photonic gloves. And what's one of the weird things about Enies Lobby? There's daylight 24/7. Kobe was actually the first one to mention Vegapunk. Even he's being involved right now, but just over at Hachinosu, which does connect to Egghead a little bit, since earlier Helmeppo mentioned stopping over at Egghead to get Seraphim to help. We even learned that the Mother Flame created a hole at Lucia very similar to the one under Enies Lobby, and that's a weapon that was made by at least one of the Vegapunks. So there's no doubt to me that what Oda is accomplishing right now at Egghead may have just been covered within Enies Lobby in his original vision of the story. Vegapunk is also very knowledgeable about devil fruits, including Luffy's fruit that he recently awakened during Wano, since he told us that the Gomu Gomu was never found in even the oldest encyclopedia. And he even gave us more details about the Warrior of Liberation, all while Luffy was fighting Lucci, someone who Luffy famously defeated in Enies Lobby, which is still my favorite fight in the series, by the way. I mean, the first time Luffy ever used any gear in the entire story was in Enies Lobby, when he used Gear 2nd against Blueno, and we also saw Gear 3rd against Lucci. The fact the gear system really took off in Enies Lobby makes me think that this is where Oda originally would have had Luffy awaken into Gear 5th if he didn't get to keep writing. These zany Looney Tunes-esque powers connected to the Sun God had to be part of his original plan from the get-go, and the only other time in the story that would have made sense up to this point would be Skypiea, since that's where we hear of gods and stuff himself anyway. But overall, I think it just makes more sense to use Skypiea as a foreshadow to the powers, somewhat like they are in the real story right now after he awakened in Wano, and if Oda had to end the story in 5 years, then having Luffy awaken at Enies Lobby on the government's turf in what would be a true attempt to take on the government would just be the perfect way to go about it. But the thing is, I don't think they would be successful on their first attempt, because Imu is also something that Oda likely has had planned since very early on, and what better time to bring out Imu than after Joy Boy reveals themselves at Enies Lobby, especially considering the fact Imu was the one to make the official call to wipe out Leloucia to make that new hole. So I think that much like we saw at Sabaody, and like we might see at Egghead now, honestly, I think the crew would lose on their first try. This would be their chance to learn what they're really up against and that they need to get stronger somehow. So sticking with that entire technology theme that I've laid out already, I almost think they would have to be saved by Kuma there instead of Sabaody, which may not even be an arc at all in Oda's original vision. And this is where things get really interesting, I think. Going back to that estimated chapter count from earlier, we'd be around 240 to maybe 250 once we leave Laugh Tale and aim to take down the government. It really depends how long of a flashback Oda wants to show us, which it could be really long, but remember, we're in a much shorter version of the story at this point, so it's kind of hard to tell. So let's say we're around 250. But we also know that Oda has always wanted to have a massive war at the end of One Piece. So how could we possibly visit some of the remaining islands in One Piece and recruit those forces for a massive war with the time that we have left? Well, the answer would have to be Kuma. Instead of slapping the crew to different islands to train over the time skip, I think you would have slapped them the places to recruit allies for a final war. And it would give us a chance to briefly see what those islands look like and their cultures and things like that. Maybe Luffy would go to Wano, maybe Usopp goes to Elbaf, Robin meets with the revolutionaries, etc. And they all tell those countries the truth that they learned and try to recruit them to fight alongside them in the final war. This would give us a chance to get a glimpse of all these different islands, but also amass a massive fleet that can challenge the government in a pretty quick amount of time. I mean, think about what we saw at Marineford, but forces from literally all over the world are meeting up, all to get behind our boy Luffy, who would be the Pirate King at this point. This could show that the Pirate King isn't just a moniker, but it actually holds weight because other pirates are following him. And this is probably something we're gonna get in the real story eventually. But our crew wouldn't be the only one assembling their forces, because both Imu and Blackbeard would be preparing their forces as well. And that's exactly why the arc after Enies Lobby is Thriller Bark. And it involved Moria, who has shadow powers. That's an interesting connection, at least to me, to Imu's powers, which seem to be kind of shadow-esque. And maybe even Blackbeard's dark abilities. At least aesthetically, there's a lot of similarities between all of them. But I'll talk more about Blackbeard in a moment, because there's a lot more to say about Imu in regards to Thriller Bark. Like, both Moria and Imu seem to have a giant freezer, one that holds oars, and one that's holding a giant straw hat. And he even tried putting a hat on his head at one point, so that could be its own connection. But I mean, Thriller Bark is also where we met Brook, who was a guy that died and came back to life, which in and of itself could mirror Joy Boy, because Luffy died before going into Gear 5th and making Joy Boy return. Also, Luffy's always wanted a musician more than anything, and that ended up being Brook, who also happens to sing Bink Sake, a song that Roger's crew sang on their way to Laugh Tale. And I mean, Brook's laugh is literally in the song. So while I doubt Oda would have a full-on Thriller Bark arc in the shorter version, there are definitely some massive storylines we can take from that which might tell us about Imu's preparation. While Moria had oars, would Imu have something better than that? I mean, Randy Troy and I talked extensively about how Joy Boy's corpse may still be out there, or maybe Imu would just have Vegapunk make another form of the Seraphim or the Mother Flame or whatever it is, but the point is that while our crew is assembling their army around the world, Imu would also be getting their own forces together. But now let's discuss Blackbeard, which also means we can discuss the arcs Amazon Lily and Impel Down. Now, obviously Sabaody happened before these, but as I mentioned earlier, the supernova were created right before that arc started and likely wouldn't be a part of the overarching story. And if the crew got separated at Enies Lobby, then we never even get to go to Sabaody anyway. But Amazon Lily and Impel Down are still vital because they're involved in Blackbeard's power-ups. Obviously, Blackbeard didn't go to Amazon Lily in the pre-time skip, but in the post-time skip, we know he tried to get Boa's fruit, and that cascaded into this entire Hachinosu situation with Kobe and Garp. There's a reason he wants her powers. When he said, if the Marines aren't gonna take it, then I will, in chapter 956, he was referring to Boa's fruit. That might be a big reason why he's taking a stake in Egghead because of S-Snake, or even Vegapunk, who knows a lot about kinda cheating with the Devil Fruit system. So instead of Amazon Lily being what it was in the pre-time skip, I think Oda would have had Blackbeard go there and just enact his plan that we're seeing now. While Luffy is getting his army and Emu is making whatever kind of preparations on their end, Blackbeard would basically be doing the same and doing what he's doing right now in the final saga. But then Impel Down would also be in ports in this version, so Blackbeard wouldn't get the same kind of access that he did before. But nonetheless, I think he'd have to go there because half of his crew right now are level 6 prisoners. Fitting right in line with this Blackbeard power-up theme during this stretch of the story, Blackbeard could have also gotten his crew at this point. Then, once we get to the actual final war, maybe he does pretty much what he did in Marineford. Sneak in last second, take Whitebeard's fruit, and show what a threat he is, except he would even have all the other parts of his plan figured out in order to just make a straight up attempt at taking over the world. So now let's talk about that final war a little bit more. I don't want to speculate too much on how the actual battles themselves would go, like how Luffy would end up beating Emu or how Blackbeard gets an upper hand at some point, because this video is already long enough and I'm saving those ideas for another one in the future. But I do want to talk about some of the characters that would be there and how the crew got there. I mentioned a little earlier how Luffy being the Pirate King may end up being more than just a title if he ends up leading all the pirates into the final war, and I also mentioned how Shanks, Whitebeard, Crocodile, and Kaido would have been the 4 emperors in a shorter version of the story. Well, guess what 4 emperors were at least meant to show up during Marineford? Whitebeard was a focal point of it, and Crocodile basically joined Luffy as it was to get out of Impel Down to get there. Shanks showed up at the end, of course, kind of like Blackbeard did, and he was probably late because he told Kaido not to come. Oda almost had all those guys show up to that war as it was, so I'm sure they all would have if it was the real final war. All 4 emperors in Pirate King Luffy could take on the government, which would truly show how Luffy's greatest strength is getting people to join his side. And throughout everything I've said so far, the one place that needs to get involved is Fishman Island. I'm not sure if Kuma can really paw people into the ocean like that, since they'd probably drown because it takes a while, so involving that island seems like a challenge. But that's where Shiarli's prophecy comes into play. Obviously we didn't learn about that till post time skip, but I think the prophecy she saw is something that was always meant to happen in Oda's planning, and it's probably because the Red Line will get destroyed, causing debris to fall down to Fishman Island, but also taking out the land of Marijois. I mean, the thing that kicks off the final war in this version may just be the Red Line getting destroyed in the first place, because of the ancient weapon Pluton. The government has always feared the ancient weapons, and I would argue they feared Pluton more than any other. Now maybe that's just because it's mentioned the most, but still. And like I mentioned earlier, it may have been planned to be the only one originally, and that's probably because it's the only one that can destroy where they live. And something that really surprised me was Marineford was only 30 chapters. I talked earlier about how Thriller Bark, Sabaody, Amazon Lily, and Impel Down could have basically just been a preparation period for all the main players instead of completely separate arcs. So instead of the 108 chapter all those arcs took, I could easily see that just being 20 to 30, honestly. So let's say those 2 sections combined would be like 50. Obviously, I've just been estimating here, but my goal was only to give an example of how the story could have at least semi-realistically been shrunken down to fit Oda's original vision. And most importantly, if the story did pan out even close to how I just outlined, there are probably some important things that we can take from it that will help us think about the final saga right in front of us. And the first thing is the order of events, that going to Laugh Tale before starting a war is likely. And some of you might already be thinking that was kind of obvious, and I would kind of agree with you, but Oda did say a couple years ago that the series will end because the most exciting part of Luffy's adventure, being the story of what is the One Piece, will come to its conclusion, which has fueled a lot of theories that things may not end as obviously as we think. But looking at how the story was set up at the beginning and kind of the sequentiality of the islands, it certainly seems like Laugh Tale would be first. And that leads me to another interesting observation. If all these major events from pre-time skip are still paramount to the end of the story, then we will need to revisit revisit most of them. And that mirrors Roger's journey quite a bit because he had to sail the Grand Line a second time after finding Lodestar Island, and then almost did it again after finding Odin. Luffy might have to do the same thing in order to finish his story. We saw in chapter 1089 that Makino's kid is becoming a big fan of Luffy because of all the pictures of him in the paper, so Oda is clearly creating another Shanks and Luffy parallel here, where a kid from the same bar Luffy met Shanks at is now becoming a fan of him. This is almost a mirror of what we just saw in Elbaf, where a giant child was a big fan of Shanks. So Oda is clearly setting up the next generation kind of in a way. Not that I think there's going to be a two-piece or anything, but it does seem like he's setting that up even if it's just a cool little thing to do. But wouldn't that hit a lot harder if Luffy actually met this kid? If we run back through all of our old islands, including the East Blue even, then Luffy meeting a kid from the next generation that he could influence would be the perfect way to wrap this up as he goes into the final war. I mean, yes, Luffy getting the One Piece and becoming the Pirate King is what we've all wanted, but as we all know, inherited will is an incredibly important layer to the story. So to see that not only has Luffy gotten to a point where he can actually accomplish those dreams, but he can also influence a kid like he once was to do the same, would show just how far he's truly made it. And as they go through the East Blue and through the Grand Line, everyone will probably be in awe at what the crew has accomplished over the last few years, growing into a true Emperor crew. And then if we look at the islands that would come after the East Blue, we definitely need to see Laboon. We will probably need to learn some stuff from Kureha at some point at Drum Island, since she knows something about the Will of D, as well as her secret to old age, since Imu was hinted to be 800 years old. And then Alabasta is already becoming increasingly important, so visiting there is definitely possible. And there are a lot of interesting things to figure out at Jaya as well. Remember the maps that they found? We still need to figure out if there's anything going on with the other missing eye. And then obviously, if Laugh Tale is near Long Ring Longland, we would literally have to go back there. And I don't see any way that Oda wouldn't explain the hole at Enies Lobby at some point either, or even the monsters at Thriller Bark. Almost every island we visited in the pre-time skip has at least a small reason to be revisited from a reader's perspective, and I'd argue some of them need to be revisited physically by the crew as well. So I bet that eventually we will almost redo the first part of the Grand Line, but Oda will show it to us in a way that kind of displays the crew's growth. They will be welcomed by each of these islands because they've made friends with them, but it will also be a lot different because it's an Emperor's crew. And what else I would say is that if you're someone who likes making theories, the best place to look is early in the story. The beginning is and always will be the best source for ideas about the ending, because Oda is an author who's written probably every chapter knowing the final chapters. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really is the best way to help with the algorithm. And YouTube told me that you might enjoy one of these two videos on the screen right here. Later.